Good morning, friends. Good morning and welcome. We're so glad you're here on this beautiful morning, and we're so happy to welcome today as our formation leader, Dr. David Heller, who is, of course, at St. Mark's, is our artist in residence, and so you'll often find him behind the keys of the organ. He also is in, did you say your 40th year at Trinity University, where he is a professor of music and university organist. So we're so delighted to have him speak with us today. This segment of our series has been looking at different aspects of Anglican tradition and liturgy and history. So we've come at that from lots of different angles. And so we're going to have a wonderful musical angle to that today. We're happy to have friends who are joining us for the first time today. And please, we're very informal in this class. So help yourself to the coffee and snacks you need. And restrooms are that way in the hallway. And I know we also typically have people who are among us who are going to have to slip out to go put on robes or be a greeter or what have you. So Dr. Heller will know you're not furious at what he's just said, but happily going out to serve. But thank you so much for being with us, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Okay. All right, a little bit of a personal aside first. As some of you might know or might not know, I'm a native of Wisconsin. I grew up in the city of Fond du Lac, which is between Milwaukee and Green Bay. And I was not raised an Episcopalian. I was raised Lutheran, the Minneapolis branch of the Lutheran Church. But down the street was St. Paul's Cathedral. Fond du Lac was the seat of a diocese of the Episcopal Church, a very high diocese. The priests were all out of Nashotah. And on occasion, I would go over to the cathedral and practice on the organ. I would be doing something like a program in the city. And on a Friday afternoon, I was practicing, and in walked the dean in his cassock. And he said, "Turn that off. Follow me." And we went into the side chapel, St. Augustine's Chapel, and he handed me a prayer book, and he said, "Do as I do. Follow me." And then the side door opened and the bishop walked in. And I was, of course, dressed in the haute couture of the 1970s, a flannel shirt and blue jeans. And the bishop gave me the once-over, and then we got started with evening prayer. This was the 1928 prayer book. The 79 prayer book had not come out yet. After it was finished, the bishop came up to me, and the dean introduced me and said, "This is the organist who's been making a lot of noise around here lately." And the bishop was very gracious, and then the dean finished off by saying, "Well, he goes to the cathedral down the street. We're trying to save him." So I became good friends with John Gulick over the years, and after I moved to Texas, and I would go to Mass at the cathedral, and thankfully he lived long enough to see that I did indeed convert to the Episcopal Church. So what we did was evening prayer. But evening prayer, when it is sung by a choir or led by someone, that's called evensong. It's the same service. And you can look that up in our prayer book. It's the exact same service. If we're going to understand evensong, well, we've got to go back. We've got to do a little bit of time travel and cross the continent. I'll go back to St. Benedict at the end of the 5th and going into the 6th century. He was the founder of the Benedictine order, but one of the things that he did was he devised what was called the rule of order for monasteries. So, in religious life at that time, what he did was he divided the day up into 6 hours of prayer, 5 hours of labor, 4 hours of study, punctuated by a daily round of worship services. So what this did was this provided structure to the community and their religious life. So here is the plan that was devised by Benedict. You will see it's punctuated by the set of services that you see, matins, lauds, prime, tierce, sect, and so forth throughout the day. So matins began before daybreak. Now try and convince college students today that they ought to wake up before daybreak. You'll never make it. Lauds, praises at dawn. Then prime, first hour, 6 a.m., tierce, the third hour, 9 a.m., sext, midday, noon, none, ninth hour, and finally vespers in the evening, and compline, completion at the end of the day. Now, of those services, the first two, matins and lauds, and the last two, vespers and compline, were considered major offices. They were longer services. The others were much shorter during the day because they were doing activities, prayer, study, labor. Now, to look a little bit further into these services, in addition to scripture reading, there were two essential elements to these services: the chanting of the Psalms. And within the period of 1 week, all 150 Psalms were covered in these services throughout the week. And then the canticles. Canticle means sung, something that is sung, a song. And these were texts from the Bible, but they were not from the book of Psalms. For instance, we have several examples of that. The Magnificat, the Song of Mary. My soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. The Song of Simeon. And if you go through the Bible, I looked this up online, there's a huge list of canticles from both the Old and the New Testament. And so these were incorporated within this series of worship services during the week. Some of those names you might recall from before, like the Benedictus, the Song of Zechariah, Blessed be our sovereign God. The Te Deum, which is not from Scripture, but it was an early hymn in the church. We praise thee, O God, we acknowledge thee to be the Lord, which was part of the Matin service. Well, that all stays in place for quite a while, and it is adopted by other orders throughout Europe. But then the Reformation comes along, and it's no small coincidence that the Reformation coincides with the Renaissance period, the awakening of the intellect, the ability to question. And there wasn't just one Reformation, there were several Reformations that were taking place in continental Europe. For instance, John Calvin in Switzerland, Zwingli, also in Switzerland, Martin Luther in the German states, and then for us, Henry VIII and Edward VI. Now, the English Reformation is a little bit different from the others. Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on the castle door in Wittenberg, Germany. That was hammered into my head in catechism class in the Lutheran Church. But the English Reformation is more of a political one at first. It's about the politics of marriage, the politics of a male heir to the throne. And then it was his son Edward, who's very young. And actually, Edward isn't doing much of the ruling. It's the body of his advisors around him that are actually leading the country. It's under Edward that we start to see more of the Reformed ideas starting to settle into the English church. So under Edward, the Church of England continues to cultivate its independence from Rome. The Act of Uniformity in 1548, but more importantly, the Book of Common Prayer, 1548-49, containing all of the liturgies for the English church, mandatory in the country. So that document, that book we have in our pew, well, it goes back to this time period. And there's the fellow who put together the Book of Common Prayer, Thomas Cranmer. You may have heard of his name from time to time, Archbishop of Canterbury, compiler, author of Book of Common Prayer, 1548. Now, this Book of Common Prayer contains all the approved worship practices in the English church, but Cranmer does something very interesting. In addition to the Mass, the service itself, he takes those monastic services of the Catholic Church. He combines matins and lauds into one service and calls them morning prayer or matins, in which he maintains the canticles, the Benedictus, the Te Deum, and others, and also keeps the important role of the Psalms in that service. And then he took the last two, Vespers and Compline, and combines those two services into one and calls it Evensong Evening Prayer, which contains the canticles, the Magnificat, the Song of Mary, and then the Nunc Dimittis, and also retains the role of the Psalms. So this is the root. This is really the foundation of what we're doing in Evensong. It's the combination of those two services from the monastic period. And then we got a little bit of upheaval to deal with here. First, Edward doesn't live very long. He is always kind of a sickly person, I guess, and he passes away. The throne goes to his older sister, Mary. Catherine of Aragon was her mother, and she wants to return England back to the one true church, apostolic and universal, which is located in Rome. She's hell-bent to do it. And Cranmer is actually burned at the stake. The effect of what happened with Mary is that all of the people who were of Reformed mind fled. They go to Holland, which is Calvinist. They go to Germany, Lutheran. And she makes them more radical than they were before. They're really picking up on all of those ideas and getting imbued in that culture. She doesn't live very long. Her reign isn't very long, and she dies of cancer, and along comes Elizabeth I, who is a Protestant. And she returns to the Church of England, reinstates the Book of Common Prayer. The reformers come back, more reformed than they were before. Under the influence of Calvin and Luther. Sounds like they're drunk or something, but Calvin and Luther. And then the great Tudor composers from this period, Thomas Tallis, William Byrd, Gibbons. Interesting enough, Tallis and Byrd were both Roman Catholic. And she tolerated it. It was fine. I think as long as you kind of kept that part of your life quiet, she didn't care. Elizabeth also was someone who loved, for lack of a better term, the trappings of the early church, the more showier elements of the service. And she loved music. That runs against some of the reformers who come back from Calvin. Calvin would only allow the psalms to be sung in the service. Under John Calvin in Switzerland, the altars were all smashed. The organs were taken out. Stained glass windows were smashed. It was very, very plain. And so she's walking a little bit of a tightrope, even with the Reformed people. That stays in place. And then the next upheaval that takes place is the Commonwealth. The monarchy is disposed. And it's another attack on the Church of England. All the organs are thrown out of worship. They're taken out. Formal music, anything that smacked of Rome, no, you can't do it. Only the Psalms were allowed to be sung in the worship services. And I saw an outline of what a worship service looked like during the time of Commonwealth. And the focus was, as you can guess, on scripture, sermon. Psalms were sung. There were no hymns. Unlike Lutheran Germany, which was flowering in hymns based on poetic texts, no, it was just the Psalms that were used within the worship service. So it was a very simple, very dry, no paraments, no, very plain. Think of it as oatmeal without anything on it. All right, so 1660, we now have the restoration of the monarchy, which brings new life back to the Church of England, but also a revival of the Book of Common Prayer, 1662. Now, it is at this point that we see more music being composed within the English church, but also a flowering of hymns with poetic texts. So they're starting to adopt what the Lutherans have been doing with regards to, okay, well, we're going to sing hymns that aren't always on the Book of Psalms. In other words, it starts to open things up a little bit more as we move into the 17th and 18th centuries. By the 19th century, of course, this is where we start to have the great flowering of music for the church, particularly with evensong. The pipe organs in England had to be brought back to life, and they were under an organ builder from Germany, Bernhard Schmidt, who came back. But the English organ had a very small pedal board. And it was Felix Mendelssohn who comes to England in the 19th century in the Victorian era and says, I can't play Bach on your instruments, because it was just a pedal board of maybe an octave and a few notes after that. You can't play the works of Bach on a small pedal board. That in turn starts the flowering of English organ building in the 19th century, the great Henry Willis. The choir experienced a wonderful Henry Willis instrument in Scotland at St. Mary's Episcopal Cathedral. We're going to do that again in Salisbury. It's a pristine Henry Willis instrument that I get to play and they get to hear. But it's during this 19th century, now we see a real flowering of composed settings of the canticles for evensong. Stanford, Stainer, all these wonderful composers during that period. The psalms are presented in what we call Anglican chant, which is 4-part harmony, in which the psalm then has to be pointed, or you have to arrange the syllables to meet this harmonic formula. Now, that's a whole other lecture for another time. But for Evensong coming up on the 15th, we are doing the psalm following the Coverdale Psalter. And we're doing the pointing that John Scott, the late John Scott, did in his Psalter. And it is not easy. It doesn't follow the way we do things here in America in our Psalter. It's far more complicated, and you're skipping notes within the formula. And for the organist, it's a bit of one of those moments where you're on the edge of the bench. Oh, did I forget that chord? Did I go to the right place? And the choir. So we're really on top of everything as we work our way through. And that's what we'll be doing in England next summer, using that version of the Psalter as opposed to what we do here in America. So this tradition of composing new settings of the canticles, the préces, the responses continues all through this period. Now, what about America? The English church, of course, is exported to the United States. The Episcopal Church, I can't remember what, it would have been after the Revolution, so the name was changed to the Protestant Episcopal Church in America, not being called the Church of England anymore. But in those early years in the United States, it was sort of low church time, very much influenced by the Reformed Calvinist practice, not necessarily embroidered, not carrying on a lot of different things that we do now today in the church. It was very simple. But throughout the 19th century, it begins to grow a little bit further. Evensong, which would have been presented in the collegiate chapels and cathedrals in England on a regular basis, was not really adopted here in America. It's only in places like choir schools, like St. Thomas Episcopal in New York City, Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, National Cathedral, Washington, D.C., where you see a regular presentation of the Evensong service throughout the week. Even in my hometown at St. Paul's Cathedral, they had a men and boy choir at the end of the 19th century. As I looked back at, found archives at the cathedral in Fond du Lac. And they had that choir in place well into the 1920s. And then after that, they disbanded the men and boy choir, were no longer a choir school, and adopted a mixed choir of men and women. So, this is where we get a lot of our practice, and this is what we do here based on what happened over in England. Now, this is our service here at St. Mark's, based entirely on evening prayer in the prayer book, which you can get your prayer book out on Sunday and look it through. And this is how we start our service. We have a procession of the choir and clergy coming in from the back. I improvise while they're coming forward. What I improvise on will vary. It depends. I usually don't think about it until about 15 minutes before. My big goal in that improvisation is I have to make sure I end in the key that the choral introit is in afterwards, so the choir can get their pitches to start the next part of the service, which is the introit sung by the choir. Opening sentences from the clergy, and then we begin with the sung phrases. O Lord, open thou my lips, and my mouth shall show forth thy praise. After that first set of responses, we now have the appointed psalm for the day. That is chosen from the lectionary or whatever is appointed. And we do that in Anglican chant and 4-part harmony. And you've heard the choir do this on occasion. We do Anglican chant for some of the Sunday psalms here. We do a nice thing about St. Mark's. We don't do psalms always the same way. We do the psalms in a variety of different ways so that you can experience those in the congregation. After the appointed psalm, we have the first lesson. Following the first lesson, here's where we have now our first canticle, the Magnificat, the Song of Mary. My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. After the Magnificat, then we have the second lesson. And then the second lesson is followed by the second canticle, the Nunc Dimittis. Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace according to thy words. Followed by the Apostles' Creed, which is chanted on a single note. Then we continue on with the next set of praeses, which includes the Lord's Prayer, a number of responses, and then collects or prayers for the day. Then we have a greeting from the clergy before we do the choral anthem. And John will pick an anthem that could be seasonal or occasional. Then the general thanksgiving. We have the concluding blessing, and then we sing a hymn with the congregation. And then following the hymn, I start the closing voluntary while the choir and the clergy process out of the church. So it's really a very simple sort of plan that this service involves, unlike what we normally face on a Sunday morning with the Mass, where we have the different portions of the Mass, the 4 different readings, communion, and the set of prayers. So why is this service so popular? And I thought about this, and I thought about my own personal experience of why I like Evensong. And going back to that experience at the age of 16, what I found attractive about it, why it spoke to me. It is contemplative, reflective. It gives you a chance to sort of just sit there and just be. Just be there for the day, just to think about things. I don't get to worship often, where I can actually sit in the pew and actually worship. And one of the things I love to do when I'm able to go to church is just sit there in quiet. I will open up the prayer book. I have my favorite prayers in the prayer book that I like to go to. Or just to sit there and think about what happened during the week, contemplate. We don't have enough quiet time in society. We don't have enough of it. And if you want to force me to run out the doors of a church, is someone coming up to me and say, hey, you're a visitor here. We need to put a visitor badge on you. It's all good to say. Leave me alone. John and I are both Virgos, which I think you're figuring out. And so we both think the same way. No, I want to just let me be. If I want to talk to you, I will talk to you after. When I would go to church at St. Thomas in New York, when I was working with Jerry Hancock, I kind of liked the fact that you walked in, the usher would nod, hand you the bulletin, and you could sit there. I like that. I just like that. It's less participatory. Some people like that. They just like to observe. And I found that with young people, that's really true. At Parker Chapel, when I was director of music there, we did a number of Evensong services. And we would have 150 to 200 students in the service. Much to the chagrin of the chaplain, Raymond Judd, who in the 11 o'clock service, we were maybe at about 30 people. And he would call me into his office and say, what's going on here? Why are they coming to this and not to? And I just kind of shrugged and I said, well, for one thing, they're in bed. Another thing, I think they like the fact that there's something that they can just sit back and just kind of be in that moment in the pew. Evensong has a rich musical heritage. Boy, the choice of repertoire. If you are a director of music in an Episcopal church, you've got centuries of music that you can select and you can choose from for an Evensong service. Think of our mission statement here at St. Mark's, giving the bread of life to the city of San Antonio, and Beth always says, and that includes the creative arts. The Evensong service is a part of that creative artistic life in the city of San Antonio. And what we do is an important contribution to our city. And we're known for our Evensong. And finally, the historical context. The fact that this goes back centuries, and it connects you to something that is so far beyond you at that moment. This goes back a long time. And I think a lot of young people identify with that, not with what's immediate. I had the experience many years ago of going to Compline at St. Mark's Cathedral in Seattle. And that service is like at 9:30 at night, I think. And lots of it was packed. University students, they're laying on their backs throughout the service while this wonderful Compline service and Gregorian chant is taking place, and they're just experiencing that spiritual aspect of their life, and they loved it. So now let's talk about February 15th, what we're going to do. The choral introit that day, O Lux Beatissima, Howard Helvey, American composer in Cincinnati. Beautiful piece, beautiful harmony, a cappella. So I know that I have to end on that chord when the choir gets all into place up there in the chancel. And then the psalm setting, Gerald Knight, English composer. This is the tone that we are using to chant the psalm is probably his best known. It is very well known in the Episcopal circles, and it's fun to match it up with this translation of the psalm. Come to the service and you'll see why it is, using the Coverdale translation of the psalm. And then the praises and responses by English composer Bernard Rose. Lovely. We've done them before. We're preparing them to take with us to England this summer. And wonderful. It's an interesting harmonization in which it divides into bass, tenor 1, tenor 2, and then alto and soprano. So it's in 5-part harmony. The canticles for this service, David Hogan, American composer. These were written for Washington National Cathedral. A rather sad story, though, with regard to David Hogan. You'll note the year that he passed away. He was unfortunately on that TWA flight to Paris, which exploded off of Long Island. Beautiful music. It's very much in the style of Herbert Howells and the English composers of the early 20th century, but has enough of a contemporary bend to it that it still sounds a little bit on the American side, and we love them. And the anthem for the day is a new work, James Macmillan, O Sing Unto the Lord, Scottish composer. This was a piece that I first learned at Trinity with the chamber singers. We recorded it for our Christmas CD, actually. And what's interesting about it is the choir does this very, very quiet sort of mysterious presentation of the psalm, O Sing Unto the Lord, a new song. And underneath it, the organ does this aleatoric series of scales. I'm just playing up and down, and doing all kinds of strange things at the organ underneath. And they're seeing this wonderful restrained harmonization that features these sort of Scottish snap rhythms. So it almost sounds like we're in the Highlands or something. It's wonderful. And then the organ all of a sudden takes over at the very end of the anthem. The choir is very quiet through the whole piece, but then the organ just sort of builds out and I take over, and then I end up on full organ by the end of the piece. I think you'll really like it. The choir here has enjoyed working on it. So that's the anthem for the day. And then I finish out with the organ voluntary from my friend Craig Phillips. Craig has announced his retirement from All Saints Beverly Hills. We were classmates together at Eastman. I have commissioned 3 works from him, and I'm going to play the last movement of his Archangel Suite for organ, which is Uriel, the Archangel of Light, as the choir and the clergy process out. So we're doing a mix of American, Scottish, and English music at this evensong. So, just a reminder, our evensong, 3:30, the pre-service. This is the San Antonio Philharmonie, which is a wind ensemble conducted by our own Brett Richardson. 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 2 horns. And I heard them rehearsing in the church yesterday. It's going to be a really wonderful program. Sometimes we do organ recitals. Sometimes we've had chamber music. We have piano recitals. So it's a way of preparing people before we start in with the service at 4 o'clock. And then, of course, as always, we have a festive reception in Gish Hall after it's all over. That in and of itself, as a nutshell, is what Evensong is all about. Hopefully, the takeaway is that you understand that this is not a contemporary service. This goes back centuries. It has its roots in the monastic tradition, thanks to St. Benedict. But our own Anglican roots have formed it into this one particular service. We had Vespers in the Lutheran Church, and some of the versicles are the same as the préces, but it was nothing like this. Nothing like this at all. And Bach himself, they had Vesper services. I haven't done enough research to know what they were doing in Lutheran Germany in the 18th century. I would love to try and find out what they were doing. But I think they did more music for voices, choir, and instrumental ensemble. That's my guess. We've got time for some questions.
The change in the 1980s of the
Prayer book?
no, not the prayer book, the hymnal. I used to be able to sing because I can't carry a tune in a bucket, and now I just read because I can't. I used to be able to follow along and sing, but with the changes and it being more melodic and whatever, now I just speak the words.
Oh, okay. The 1940 hymnal and 1982 hymnal, yeah, there are a lot of differences between the two. There was much that was retained, but one of the things I appreciate about the 82 hymnal is its incorporation of newer things, of newer hymns, particularly hymns from the southeastern Appalachia area of the United States, things like Wondrous Love, Take up thy cross, da-dum-bum-bum. I love hymns of that nature. And a lot of new hymns by American composers. I can't read the hymnal 82 as it's in. I have to blow it up. If you look at what I play on Sunday, I do like 120% blow up that I have in my binder because I don't like the small print.
I have a question about the Psalter. So your Anglican chants got a different, what's it like, more like an 8-point kind of a thing, I think, as opposed to the ones we kind of tend to do on those Sunday mornings, right? It's kind of fewer transitions. So do they have different Psalters pointed by different people for the different settings, or is it just kind of a couple groupings of settings?
There are people who have done different pointing. For instance, the pointing that we're using for the Evensong was done by the late John Scott, who was at St. Paul's Cathedral and then came to New York to St. Thomas.
What time period? What time period late?
He did that pointing in the latter part of the like in the 1990s or so. I have a copy of it in my office. But the text itself is the Coverdale. It's the old 16th century translation of the Psalms. Typically, what we've done here is we use the American Psalter Alec Whiten, who has pulled together. But we've done a mix of both, and John wants to make sure that the choir is comfortable using what they use in England. So it's better to get it into their system now before we go over there. It's one less thing to worry about.
What about the effect of the Wesleyans and the Methodist revival in the 18th century? How did that affect?
That did not affect that didn't affect the effect of the Wesleyans was it opened up a whole new avenue of hymnody and our worship experience, but it did not affect like the evensong service or anything that was going on in the Anglican Church. And I love the Wesley hymns.
Yeah.
Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing thy great redeemer. We sing that all the time, and congregation loves singing it. So it's enriched our hymn repertoire.
Yes, very bad.
Yes. You have to think about the Wesleys being out on horseback, going out into the countryside and evangelizing.
Is there a schedule of evensong, and why is an evensong like sung daily here in the United States when it's sung daily at the cathedrals that we visited in England?
You have to have a resident choir. In other words, you have to have a choir that is there, and that's practically the only thing that they do. Here in the United States, that's a problem. You have to have a choir always present to do that. Here at St. Mark's, we do a schedule of maybe 2 in the fall, 3 in the spring. It's difficult to maintain that with a volunteer choir, plus prepare all of the music for Sunday morning when they only rehearse once a week. That's a time that takes a lot of time. When you're rehearsing daily, say like at St. Thomas up in New York City, where the boys are rehearsing every single day, and then the men are all professional singers. They just come right in and fill in. Now, St. Thomas has gone through a change in which they're now incorporating a mixed choir. So it's really interesting to see what transpires there with their worship practice. But you really have to have a resident choir to work with, where they're rehearsing constantly. We have a really fine choir, and putting together some of these evensongs it's work, in addition to what we're doing on Sunday morning. So I think that's another reason why we don't. I think it would kill them. It'd kill the organist.
Curiosity, do you ever have you ever run into a situation in rector to do something?
Yes.
That's not because of the track.
Yes, I cannot, but that's not the situation here. That's not the situation here at St. Mark's. But yes, I have run into that. I've run into that outside of the Episcopal Church with Lutheran ministers who, had one idea of what they wanted, or even when I worked at Parker Chapel, Raymond Judd and I were like this. And he was also a Virgo. His birthday was just a few days before mine, but there were times when his Presbyterian leanings and my leanings, Episcopal Lutheran, were like, And I think when I introduced incense, that just about got me fired. I think, because I said, and he just said, it's close to Roman here. I'm not kneeling. I said, that's okay, Raymond, just do what you want. But now I've had times, but no, not here. The clergy support everything that we do musically.
The boards in most churches take place between the music director and the priest, because normally they both have enormous egos. But what's important to know is that the prayer book is very clear in that the rector shall have final say in all matters concerning music. But what changed between the 1928 prayer book and the 1982 was, in the 1928 it said that the rector may seek guidance from the music director. The 1982 prayer book said, 79 prayer book said that the rector should seek guidance from the music director.
Thank you, Ed.
David, so I've got more of a comment than really a question. From a personal perspective here, having been in the choir now 18 years, not imagine Ed started the whole pilgrimage program here. Opted and now try to do it every 3 years. Walk into these cathedrals that have been there for centuries and to sing where their choir sings every week is just unbelievable. First couple of times I went, I was kind of surprised at the lack of attendees sometime in some of the cathedrals. When we got to St. Paul's in 2023, we had 500,000 people at Evensong. When we sang Eucharist, we sang, I think, 2 Eucharists this trip. We're singing 3 Eucharists. We actually sit on the floor of the cathedral under the dome, and the clergy was saying, 1,500, 2,000 people there. And the thing you really have to get adjusted to is they're open for touring. So while we're rehearsing, the very limited amount of time we get in the cathedral, it's hard to follow John when you've got all these people walking behind you and all this kind of stuff. But the first time we walked up to St. Paul's, from the choir room is in the crypt down below, and just seeing everything from that perspective, sitting in the choir, QUIRE stalls, listening to David play, and when the organ would stop or the choir would stop singing, 9 or 10 seconds of reverb through the nave of the cathedral. It is truly a life-changing experience. I really can't put into words, because we're carrying on the tradition that's been there for centuries.
And it was daunting to sit at that organ at St. Paul's for the first time. You realize who's played it.
Yeah.
And you realize that instrument's life span.
Yeah.
And then you start to look at its it's like the cockpit of a 747, literally. Once you get over the initial fear, I fall into the instrument. Okay, this is. I know I got to keep that swell box shut. It's loud, and actually, by this next day, I'm like, okay, I got this. This is good.
And one of their assistant organists was very helpful to David. He would sit with David at the console and suggest registrations and say, "Oh, that's not loud enough," and start pulling stops out.
I was afraid I was going to be too loud. And he said, "No more." And finally, when we had to do hymns, he said, "Do you mind if I just change your hymn registrations while you're playing?" I said, "No, go ahead." And so he's sitting there on the sequencer, and each verse kept going further and further. And I'm like, really? Okay, all right. This is pretty good. I like this.
But lastly, and then I'll shut up, I think the biggest kudos we could have had, and the proudest I think we've been, is that the clergy at St. Paul's invited us to come back. And for them to do that, I think speaks to the program. We worked so hard here. And during COVID, we were supposed to have gone to 23 several years earlier, but COVID obviously delayed that. And they held the week open for us when everything opened back up. They kept our week they had reserved for us to come back. So it's an experience. I really can't put it any way than that.
And yeah.
Hi there. I'm embarrassed to say I'm probably the only person in this room who's never been to Evensong.
That's okay.
I will fix that next week.
That's
I'm
okay.
very excited to attend. I really enjoyed your presentation today. I feel like you're an excellent teacher, and I see that you work at Trinity, and I'm just curious about what it is that you do at Trinity. Tell us about what you do outside of your involvement here at St. Mark's.
Well, Trinity is my day job. Matter of fact, my boss is over there off to the side, Dr. Vanessa Beasley. I teach music theory in the first year. I teach organ. I teach harpsichord. And then I was involved in what we call the first year experience program, which is a course that all the first year students have to take, in which we work with their writing and their research skills. And I love teaching writing. I learned that no one knows how to use a semicolon in high school. I love teaching writing because I had good instructors when I was an undergraduate at Lawrence University Matter of fact, I had the future president of Lawrence, Rick Warch, as one of my teachers, and I learned how to write from him, and therefore I like to teach writing to undergraduates. And then as university organist, I play all of the university events that require an organ for organ music, like commencement, convocations, that sort of thing, or anything that the chaplain at the university needs me to do. Oh no.
I can't resist the opportunity. Thank you for being so welcoming. I'm Vanessa Beasley, as you heard, president of Trinity University. This is my husband, Trey. We are so proud to have Professor Heller on our team. As he said, he's not only an amazing professor, you heard an example of his teaching today, but he's also just such an important member of the university community. And I have to say this, when he plays at commencement, we always think there might be a little bit of the Star Wars Death March, theme coming in as we walk down. And we joke about that, but he makes everything he participates in beautiful and perfect and worthy of our students and our community. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone.
And a lovely human being. We're so glad to have you here, Dr. Heller. Thank you so much for sharing. This was a delight. And we probably need to let you scamper off to the bench.
Yep. I'm going to shut this down. I'm going to head downstairs. Thankfully, John's playing the first half of the service today, so.
Thank you.